John chapter 9, verses 13 through 38. Are you there? They brought to the Pharisees the man who had been born blind. Now the day on which Jesus had made the mud and opened the man's eyes was a Sabbath. Therefore the Pharisees also asked him how he had received his sight. He put mud on my eyes, the man replied, and I washed, and now I see. Some of the Pharisees said, this man is not from God, but he does not keep the Sabbath. But others said, how can a sinner perform such signs? So they were divided. Then they turned again to the blind man. What have you to say about him? It was your eyes he opened. The man replied, he is a prophet. They still did not believe that he had been born blind and had received his sight until they sent for the man's parents. Is this your son, they asked. Is this the one you say was born blind? How is it now that he can see? We know that he is our son, the parents answered. And we know that he was born blind. But how he can see now, who opened his eyes, we don't know. Ask him. He is of age, he will speak for himself. His parents said this because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders, who already had decided that anyone who acknowledged that Jesus was the Messiah would be put out of the synagogue. That's why his parents said, he is of age, ask him. A second time they summoned the man who had been born blind. Give glory to God by telling the truth, they said. We know this man is a sinner. He replied, whether he is a sinner or not, I don't know. One thing I do know, I was blind, but now I see. Then they asked him, what did he do to you? How did he open your eyes? He answered, I done told you already and you didn't listen. Why do you want to hear it again? Do you want to become his disciples too? Then they hurled insults at him and said, you are this fellow's disciples. We are the disciples of Moses. We know that God spoke to Moses. But as for this fellow, we don't even know where he comes from. The man answered, now that is remarkable. You don't know where he comes from, yet he opened my eyes. We know that God does not listen to sinners. He listens to the godly persons who does his will. Nobody has ever heard of opening the eyes of a man born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. To this they replied, you were steeped in sin at birth. How dare you lecture us? And they threw him out. Jesus learned that they had thrown him out. And when he found him, he said, do you believe in the Son of Man? Who is he, sir? The man asked. Tell me so that I may believe in him. Jesus says, you now have seen him. In fact, he is the one speaking with you. Then the man said, Lord, I believe, and he worshiped him. I want to use for a subject, count your blessings. Count your blessings. When you get home and you read the entire chapter of John, you'll find out that this man actually received his sight in verse 7. But the full account of what happened goes all the way to verse 41. So if you do the old math, you see there are 35 other verses that share with us what happened after he received his sight. So the first 7 verses talk about the blessing. And the next 35 verses tell us what happened after he starts to count his blessings. And what we're going to find out this morning is what Jesus gives this man is a lot more than the ability to see. But there's some other blessings that are mightier than the miracle. Some other blessings that are greater than what was given. And some other blessing that goes beyond this one blessing. Because when we know that the Lord has blessed us in ways that we don't deserve it, and when the Lord has delivered us from what we didn't ask for, and when you know the Lord has touched you in spite of what other people have said about you, there's some other things that should be happening in our lives after the blessing. And the first thing that I want to suggest to us is that when the Lord has blessed us, when the Lord has gone above and beyond what we asked him for, when the Lord has given us what we are unworthy of, It ought to allow us to keep on living without anybody's help but the Lord's. And it's right there in verse 13 when it tells us that they brought the Pharisees to the man who had been born blind. Now you ought to be asking yourself two questions right about now. And the first question is, who is they? And the second question is, why did they bring him to the Pharisees? Because why bring the Pharisees into this? Because they don't like Jesus. So why involve the Pharisees with something that the Lord has done? But the answer goes back to when Jesus healed a man with leprosy. That's recorded in Matthew 9, Mark 1, and Luke 5. And after Jesus heals this man with leprosy, he tells the man to go show yourself to the priest. And Jesus does that because according to the law of Moses in Leviticus chapter 14, when a man who has leprosy has been cured, in order to get back into society, he had to show himself to a priest who would examine the man's body to make sure that there were no remnants of leprosy. And if the priest had decided that the man had been cured, then the man had to bring 2 turtle doves to the priest. One that was used for a sacrifice, and the blood of the dove was sprinkled all over the man with leprosy, and sprinkled all over the other dove, which was released into the air, symbolizing that the man had been cured, and now the man could go back into the world. And so the purpose of the priest was to verify that the man had been healed, and to validate him as being acceptable into society. Now I need y'all to see this, because the purpose of showing yourself to religious leaders is so they could verify that you had been healed and to prove that you've been blessed. And they had to validate you so that you could get back into your right standing into society. So we needed them to say that we're okay. We needed them to say that we're not worthy. We needed a stamp of approval in order to get back into the community. So I want to suggest that they, whoever they were, took the man to the Pharisees because they wanted the Pharisees to verify and validate that the blind man had received his sight. So the Pharisees had to give them their stamp of approval for him to be able to come back into the synagogue. And y'all, if that's the case, and if this man needs church folks' validation, then his attitude and his position with church folk worries and scares me. Because if he needs church folks' validation, you would think that he would play nice with them. You would think that he would bow down to them. And if he really needed church folk to co-sign his life, you would think that he would have done what they wanted him to do. But y'all, when this man gets into church, he's irritated with the church folk. He's got an attitude and he talks back. He stands his ground and he teases them. And how can he have an attitude with the Pharisees and the church folk, but he needs them to validate him? And here it is, y'all, because he recognizes that what the Lord did for him is so great that he doesn't need anybody else to verify or validate who he is in the Lord. And he realizes that I don't need them because I have him. And if I have him, I don't need them because them can't do what him can do. And as long as I have him, I don't need anybody to validate when I know the Lord has blessed me when I was blind, so now I don't need you to validate me. And when you know the Lord has been good to you, when you know that God has blessed you, you realize that you don't need the approval of man to walk in the favor of God. And God has been so good to me that if you don't like me, you don't have to validate me because God already has me. So now let me show y'all how you can pick out the people in Progressive who know that the God has been good to them. Let me show you how you can recognize somebody on your row who knows that the Lord has blessed them with what they don't deserve. It is not by how loud they shout, but how you know that I've been blessed. It's not how loud I shout to God, but it's by what I'm willing to ignore and turn my back on. Because after the Lord has blessed you, you don't care what people say about you. You don't care what people think about you. You don't care what people heard about you because God has been too good to me. And is there anybody here this morning that has some I don't care in your spirit because the Lord has done some good things in your life? And y'all, I think I figured out why this man doesn't care about these church folk. And I need y'all to get this because he was blind and now he sees. And he says to himself that even if these church folk don't validate me, that I'm still going to be able to see. So now I ain't worrying about nobody who can't take away what the Lord has already given me. Because the Lord has a way of giving you some blessings that nobody can't take away from you. And you don't have to bow down to nobody who doesn't have the power to take away your blessing. Now I need y'all to watch the text, because this man is blind, he's a beggar, and he's a sinner. And all of these things have public effects, financial consequences, and spiritual concerns. Because this man is at the bottom of the ladder. He's blind, he's broke, and he's a sinner. So he doesn't have a position in the church. He doesn't have a title in the church. Nobody ever asks him what he thinks, because he's at the bottom of the ladder. But when he gets in the church, and the church folks start acting funny, watch how he raises up. Because he talks with some sarcasm in verse 25. And he says, all I know that I was blind, but now I see. And y'all keep asking me the same question over and over. And he says in verse 27, I done told y'all already, and y'all ain't listening. So why do y'all want to hear it again? Y'all want to become one of his disciples too. And in verse 28, the Pharisees push back. And they say, slow your roll, man, because you are this fellow's disciple. We are Moses' disciple. And we don't even know where this man comes from. But watch how this man keeps raising up. And he says in verse 30, y'all are asking the wrong questions, because y'all trying to figure out where he came from, when all I really care about is that he opened my eyes. And nobody in the history of the world has ever opened blinded eyes. And this man wasn't from the Lord, he couldn't do what he does. And watch how he gets them told in verse 31. When he says that we know that God does not listen to sinners. Now this man is blind and he's broken. But he gets around church folk and he says, and we know that the Lord doesn't listen to sinners. So he's blind and he's broken. But when he gets around these church folk, the Lord has blessed him so much that he can stand toe-to-toe with anybody in that church. And he says that we know that the Lord doesn't listen to sinners. And watch how the Pharisees respond in verse 34. Because they want to know who is we. Because you will steep that birth. So how dare you lecture us because we ain't part of no we. And y'all know they throw him out of Progressive. Not because he's talking about Jesus, but because he had the nerve to believe what the Lord has done for him makes him equal to everybody else in Progressive. And I may have started out at the bottom, but when I think about how good God has been to me, and the ways God has made for me, and the blessings God has given me, I can walk in a room with anybody and realize there ain't none of y'all better than me. And I can stand toe-to-toe and know the Lord has been good to me. So now let me tell y'all again how to recognize people who know how to count their blessings. Because when you know how to count your blessings, you're not intimidated by other people. And you can walk in here on a Sunday morning knowing that no matter what you have, that the Lord has been gooder to you than he's been good to me. And I can sit on any row in this church and look at everybody around me and know that none of y'all have been more blessed than I've been blessed. Can I preach it right up in here? Because they might have come in a Honda and you might have came in a Hyundai. She might be carrying Prada and you might be carrying Payless. They might own 2 houses and you just thankful for a bath and a half. They might earn $700 a week and you earn $7 an hour. But when you know how good God has been to you, you can sit on the same row and look at their Honda and look at their Prada and still shout louder than your neighbor, because you know that God has been better than you than anybody else around you. And is there anybody in the house this morning who knows that God has been good to you? Tell somebody, I ain't intimidated by you. So when you know how to count your blessings, it ought to allow you to keep on living without nobody's validation but the Lord's. It ought to make you feel equal and on par with anybody. And here's the last one. Because when you know how to count your blessings, you ought to be willing to praise the Lord anywhere. And y'all, that just means the way I praise God will not be limited to a place and a time. The way I worship God will not be confined to 4 walls. Because you think that the only place that I know how to give God praise is on the Sunday, that I want to encourage you to follow me home and recognize if you think that I talk about God big up in here, You ought to see when it's just me and the Lord on a Monday morning. When I look around my house and see all my clothes in the closet. I see the food in the refrigerator. So it doesn't have to be on a Sunday. Doesn't have to be in the sanctuary. But whenever I think of the goodness of the Lord and all that he's done for me, I worship him right there. And is there anybody in the house this morning who has more than a Sunday shout, more than a Wednesday worship? Because I will bless the Lord at all times, and his praise shall continually be in my mouth. I'm coming to my close, y'all, but I got to close like the chapter closed, because the Bible says that the Pharisees threw him out of the church, and that's where Jesus found him. So y'all, the Pharisees threw him out, and even if he wasn't looking for Jesus, but Jesus wasn't found him, he was out in the streets, the Lord wasn't looking for him. Good morning, saints, and may the Lord bless you real good. But there's somebody in here this morning, and that's your testimony. It is not that you found the Lord, but your testimony is that the Lord found you. When you were outside of his will, you were outside of his way, that he still brought you out of some stuff, still delivered you from some stuff. He kept you out of some stuff, and I will bless him wherever he is. So when he shows up in my bedroom, I'll worship him right there. When he shows up at the hospital, I'll worship him right there. When he shows up on Scarborough Road, I'll worship him right there. And y'all, wherever I am, I'll count my blessings, and I'll name them one by one. And it will surprise you to see what God has done. I'll count my blessings so every doubt will fly. And I'll sing it as the days go by. I'll count my blessings that money cannot buy. My reward is heaven, nor my home on high. I'll count my blessings because angels will attend. Help and come forgive you to your journey's end. And y'all, I'll count my blessings and I'll name them one by one so you can see what the Lord has done. God bless y'all.